I began playing D&D back in 1980, so that kind of gives you a sense for how old I am. At that time, I played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons as well as Basic Expert Rules. I played that until 2016, until I started playing 5th edition. And since 2016, I've played kind of a mix of old school rules and 5e, and I've got some comments about the differences between them and specifically 5e. So I've broken these down into 3 categories. And then I'm going to talk about a bonus observation that I think you probably will want to hear. That's at the end of the video, so stay tuned. The first thing I want to talk about is combat and player boredom. And I call this the phone test. You can tell in 5e games when your players are getting bored because they pull out their smartphone and start surfing, checking social media and so forth when it's not their turn. And I think this is part of the inherent problem with 5e is that when it's your turn, you have all kinds of stuff that you can do, but when it's not your turn, you're doing nothing. Now, in old school rules, it was quite a bit different. Everybody would do movement, and then everybody would do missiles, and then everybody would do their magic, and then it would do melee. And then you rotate through the monsters, and then you repeat that cycle. So your chance to do something was a lot more frequent. In 5th edition, there's a lot of activity and then a lot of no activity. And you'll notice that a lot of people, much more famous than I am in the D&D space, have various hacks and things that you can do both as a dungeon master and as a player to combat this boredom. But the problem is the game itself is set up so that because everyone is doing their own thing all at once and then nothing, it's just kind of inherent in the way combat is run. So I think that's one of the biggest problems with 5e is player boredom. And if, as a dungeon master or even as a player, if you find people around the table digging out their phones, then something needs to be done about combat to make it a little more exciting. And there are ways to do that, but that's kind of one of the biggest problems. The second challenge I see with 5th edition is that it takes so long to create a character that most often your group will have a special session just for creating characters and setting things up. It's called Session 0. And that is, I think, kind of a violation of fun. Creating a character when you think about what class you want to play and what race or species and how you want to create your character, that is its own source of fun. But when you're wasting, and I use the word wasting kind of judiciously here, when you're spending a great deal of time, an entire session, doing nothing but creating characters, that's a waste, in my opinion. You want to create characters and you want to have some fun with that, but really the fun of your character is playing the character, not so much creating the character. And I know that there are players who feel very differently about that. They just create characters just for fun, but that's something that is fun that you can do kind of on your own. You don't need to waste a bunch of other people's time, especially if scheduling is a challenge, finding a location is a challenge. You don't want to be inefficient with your time. You want to create your characters and get on to play. In old school rules, by contrast, you should be able to reasonably create a character in 5 to 10 minutes, and then you're playing. So that again speaks to the complexity of 5e. And I've heard someone talk about creating a character in 5th edition is about like filling out your taxes here in the United States. I know people in Europe may not feel the same way, but it's very complex. And the number of pages that you have to flip back and forth between and the combination or matrix of combinations that you can create is insane. And instead of making things simpler or more streamlined, Wizards of the Coast really just makes it even more complex. So much so that to be able to describe how to create characters to someone who is brand new to D&D takes a very special skill. I am a dungeon master for a teens group at my local library, and we have session zeros for new players who have never played D&D before of any edition. And describing how to create a character is a very complex process. We've tried to create cheat sheets and guides and that kind of stuff, but even then, they're many, many pages long. There's really no easy way to summarize that. So I think that's one of the challenges with 5th edition is with great, variety comes great complexity. And I think it has jumped the shark in terms of all the different options that you can play, so much that it has gotten away from a let's get to playing quickly kind of scenario or purpose. So that's another frustration. So I want to talk about play itself as a player in D&D. In 5th edition, when you look at your character sheet, you will notice it has all of these stats, all of these values and modifiers and so forth. And there's many, many different categories that you have to look at and choose from. And it's part of the reason why character creation is so complex in 5e. But what I have found is that in 5th edition, when players are going about the game, they are finding their solutions by looking at numbers on their character sheet instead of using the gray matter between their ears. So here's an example. A party comes upon a magical door. It's obviously magical, but they need to figure out a way to get through it. So the player asks themselves, is this an Arcana check? Is it an intelligence check? Is it an investigation check? Which is it? Well, the problem is the player is looking for a solution to this challenging problem by trying to figure out what number on their character sheet gives them the answer. And then, of course, they roll some dice. But what this does is it takes problem solving, which is one of the most inherent parts of Dungeons and Dragons and one of the best aspects of its fun, and it makes it more abstract. So instead of figuring out how this door works by asking leading questions and doing just some basic investigative work, the player is asking themselves, what roll do I need to make to find the answer? And they don't even find the answer. They're just getting the answer from some other source. So here's another example. It's a bit like using AI, like ChatGPT and so forth, to write an article. You don't actually use that to write an article. You're just creating a prompt to generate a result. And you are now separated from your result because of the way the system works. In old school rules, it was up to the players to say, I touch around the door and I see if it feels different. I cast Detect Magic, or I touch it with my 10-foot pole. They do different things using their mind and their creativity and their problem solving to figure out how to overcome this obstacle, to figure out the puzzle. Nowadays, it's just roll a d20 and see if your investigation check is high enough to get an answer from the DM. And the DM then says, here's some information, here's some clues, but you have to roll some dice to get that answer. That's one of the things that I feel 5e takes the classic problem-solving joy of Dungeons & Dragons and kind of takes that away from the players. Ultimately, I think the players are the ones that kind of lose out from that experience. So unfortunately, that's, 5th edition puts your answers as numbers on your character sheet instead of in your brain. Before I continue to my bonus topic, I wanted to see, what do you think about these ideas? What do you think about these observations? How do you handle player boredom during combat in a 5th edition game? How do you feel about character creation? Is it something you just want to get through, or is it something that you actually love about 5e? I know that there's a lot of variety in 5th edition compared to older editions and so forth, but that process is a pretty long one. So what do you feel about that? And then finally, how do you feel about relying on checks to solve problems in D&D? Does that still feel like problem solving to you? Is it fun for you? Do you feel like that makes the game more accessible to people who perhaps aren't used to the problem solving aspect of D&D? So let me know in the comments what you think about these observations, I would say. So finally, this bonus topic is, again, this is an observation, and I have noticed that of all of the different third-party rules publishers that I have seen that have variations of 5th edition rules, there seems to be something in common that they are all trying to accomplish. They are trying to streamline the 5th edition rules as published by Wizards of the Coast. And I think that's very telling that the original game source of the rules is so complex that the main problem, the most common problem that other people are trying to solve, is to streamline it, to make it easier, to make combat faster. And I think that kind of validates my observations to a certain extent. If it's kind of like I used to own a motorcycle, and one of the very first things that people that bought that particular motorcycle would do is change out the saddle, because the original seat that came on that motorcycle was so uncomfortable. That was the first thing everybody would change. Well, the manufacturers should take a clue about that and say, nobody likes the saddle on our motorcycle. They always change it out, so we might as well do that ourselves and make it a selling point. And I've noticed that when the 2024 edition of D&D came out from Wizards of the Coast, the books themselves presented their content in a little bit more organized manner, but the complexity remains. Combat is still complex. Character creation is equally or perhaps even more complex than it used to be. And you're still relying on checks and so forth on your character sheet for solutions. So these inherent fundamental challenges, I will say, about 5th edition D&D still remain. And I think Wizards of the Coast lost some opportunity there to truly improve the game. And I think they're just kind of either afraid of too much change, or they don't want to spend the time and the money on it. So who knows? Thanks for watching. I hope that you found this enjoyable, entertaining, and thought-provoking. I know that these are opinions, they aren't facts, so I'm really curious to see what you think about these ideas and these topics. If you like this video, be sure and click the like button. Be sure to subscribe to support the channel. And as always, keep your dice rolling, stay cool, and have fun.